Welcome back, folks, to Colonial Worlds and Women's Lives. We cover the period here in this lecture roughly from the founding of the Jamestown colony in 1607 to the doorstep of the American Revolution in 1750. So, about a century and a half of colonial history here, that is, of the English colonies of North America. And we like to telescope the pre-revolutionary colonial history of the United States, usually compacting it in our memories, at least, with maybe the beginning of discovery with Columbus, as it's usually attributed, to maybe the arrival of the Pilgrims, and then basically in the wink of an eye to Bunker Hill, or the Boston Massacre and the American Revolution. But keep in mind, this was a century and a half of history that is equal to the period that separates us, for example, from the Civil War. So far from being a compacted, narrow realm of history, the colonial era stretched out over decades and decades and generations. So much to say then in our lecture on colonial worlds and women's lives. If I had to summarize the first part of this lecture, if we had to come up with, say, three top points from the previous part of the lecture, that is part one, I would say that they were probably this. Number one, the colonies were a reflection of England's overriding ambition, particularly following the defeat of the Spanish Armada and the reign of Elizabeth I. England's overriding ambition to establish a colonial and commercial empire that could rival those of Spain and Portugal, of France, and of the Dutch. Number two, the English were concerned with dominion, not freedom. This was a movement of conquest and colonization, after all, and so dominion rather than freedom would have been the byword of England's imperial ventures. And then finally, women's lives, the main subject of this lecture, can break down into two broad categories, I think, of, familiar categories. Let's say haves and have-nots. For the women who found their way to the English colonies, to Jamestown and Virginia, for example, as indentured servants, life was harsh, as we saw. Mortality rates were high. Life expectancy was rather short. And the world was really fraught with peril. For those, however, who over time will come not as servants, but as immigrants, either as part of family migrations or perhaps as well-connected women coming to, say, marry well-heeled property-owning men, we'll say they represent the halves of this equation, then life could be really very different, as we'll see. So, Colonial Worlds and Women's Lives, 1607 to 1750, Part 2. One of the unmistakable consequences of the commercial ambitions of the English in the Tidewater region of the Chesapeake was the rise of a new commercial kingdom, one might say, ruled by the cash crop that was worth its weight in gold, and that, of course, was tobacco. And it was the success of tobacco as a merchantable cash crop across the Atlantic, the supply, the booming demand of European consumers now in places like London, for example, in England, the great capital city, we'll see the proliferation of smokehouses and smoke shops where people will begin to acquire the habit of smoking as part of a new cultural and social uh, enterprise. And so it was the New World suppliers of that tobacco that will realize really great profits in the commerce of England's maritime commercial empire. And those who take greatest advantage of the opportunities for production and scale and proficiency in supplying the markets, those were the men who will come to be known as the Tidewater elites. And the Tidewater elites are by and large middle class merchants from England who will begin to buy up available land and property in the Chesapeake, sort of pushing aside smaller producers, the first generation of tobacco farmers, as we see a kind of consolidating of interests and property, such that by the late 1600s, the Tidewater elite come to represent a kind of new world financial and political elite in places like Virginia and Maryland. And you can see this painting of a plantation, a tobacco plantation, with a great house at the center rising above the plantation, and the various workshops and servants' quarters and drying sheds. It resembled a kind of medieval kingdom or a medieval fiefdom, and the ship in the foreground along the river dock, whether it be the James or the Rappahannock rivers, these great riverways of the Chesapeake, suggest that this was a global enterprise. These cargo ships carrying Virginia tobacco will sail certainly to England, but even points beyond, eventually across the globe to China and elsewhere. So a growing global enterprise now in marketable cash crops such as tobacco. The manners of a community may be regarded as one great chain. Thus was the claim made by one of these Tidewater elites who saw his economic fortunes now rising along with that of England. The idea that to live in the Western Hemisphere and to profit and to prosper and to acquire property, that made one's fortunes, but also one's reputation as part of an Atlantic world whose shores were bounded by England herself, by the New World trading colonies such as Virginia and the islands of the West Indies, and of course Africa as well, where the Atlantic slave trade will provide economic connection for the growing mercantile interests of England. But within that matrix of Atlantic interests then were the men of the Chesapeake, the great Tidewater elites, the planters, the tobacco planters in particular, who were able to take advantage of the opportunities and to build their middle class fortunes into something resembling at least the fortunes of the English gentry class. Keep in mind, these men, these New Worlders, were not actually noblemen. They were not from the great families of England. They were in effect self-made men who earned enough wealth and profit from their tobacco enterprises to begin outfitting themselves in the clothes and styles of the English gentry elite. So whether it was buying fine crafted clothing, silks, for example, and cottons and calicos from across the Atlantic world, to fine furniture, and well, even the commissioning of a great portrait for one's family to be placed in the meeting hall of the plantation home. These were meant to mimic and to equal the material power of England's traditional nobled elites. And the unmistakable thing about this particular image that would indicate it being an Atlantic world portrait located somewhere in the West Indies or in Virginia, the Chesapeake, is the presence, of course, of the servant girl here whose skin betrays her not as an English indentured servant, but as either an indigenous person or person of mixed race belonging to the Western Hemisphere, and so locating this squarely in the geography now of the New World. And notice the exaggerated pallor of the planter's family, the wife, the daughter, the father, the patriarch, the exaggerated pale whiteness of their complexions so as to make every distinction between their status and the indigenous peoples of the Americas or even the enslaved African peoples of the Americas. So the beginnings really of what will come to be a kind of racial categorization of New World's peoples. We sometimes assume that race, that is the distinguishing of people by skin color, is somehow as old as time, but it really isn't. It's really the product of this era in which peoples of different colors, of different geographical places, are brought together in the nexus of these imperial networks and become part of that great chain that the quote refers to. Yes, they were colonials, but they wanted to have the status and standing of the cultural status and standing of the traditional English gentry, which, according to historian Matthew McConaughey, a culture that was simultaneously exotic and thoroughly English. So, if we think about this for a second, thoroughly exotic, different from England and yet thoroughly English. Whether the exotica came from the diversity of the peoples not found typically in England or through some other facet of living in the Western Hemisphere, perhaps the cuisine or maybe the language, that is something New World in its distinction. That the roots ultimately of separation are there from the beginning. So no matter much this family wishes to be seen as English and even cultured English people, there was already something at work that would eventually distinguish them and separate their peers from those of England. So a self-styled gentry. Remember, the gentry by tradition in England were the landowning noble class of people. The same word from which words like gentleman come, denoting status. But the New World gentry, born from hard-driving merchants and tobacco planters, not by gentry of England. And yet to look at them, to look at their accoutrement, their clothing, their lavish lifestyles, one would think they were certainly the equal in appearance to the traditional nobility of England. 9 out of the 10 richest people in the colonies were planters, so there's no mistaking that the cash crop market for America's produce, including principally tobacco in Virginia, but elsewhere sugar, for example, was the surest road to wealth. Here we see Evelyn Byrd, the daughter of the richest tobacco planter of all, William Byrd. Her father was the great patriarch of a family fortune made in tobacco, and the portrait here he commissions for his daughter was, a kind of claim made by William Byrd of his own place now in the hierarchy of distinguished gentlemen linked by that chain to the men of distinction in England. So property claims, and also for nurturing the cultural style that landed wealthy Americans in the who's who of their day, if you will. The dress, the setting, the posture, everything about it really rings true to the kind of romantic traditions of the English gentry. And just so these New World girls would understand how to behave like the refined daughters of English elite, there were tracts and pamphlets and essays printed. Here we see the complete housewife or accomplished gentlewoman's companion, giving advice in everything from cookery to pastry, confectionery, preserving, pickles, cakes, creams, jellies, made wine, cordials. You think about this menu here, teaching these young women to to bring these items to the table, whether it be for socializing or for entertaining. These are not the average fare of a daily diet, certainly not the average fare of a servant's diet or a laborer's diet, but of the wealthy, affluent peoples now of this new class of property owners. And so it was important to learn the cultural protocols, to learn the cultural ways of refined people. Living in a world framed by transatlantic commerce, those with the financial means cultivated what we might call a conspicuous and self-conscious style. A conspicuous and self-conscious style called gentility. Gentility, again, from the same root as gentlemen and gentry and generations. This is a tradition and a Latin word that goes all the way back to the time of the Romans, but which had been mimicked in the post-Roman age of Europe among the wealthy landowning military classes of Europe, including England, who sought to make themselves over in the style of the Roman gentry. And so the word survived, the tradition survived, and now reborn in the Americas. Because again, I cannot emphasize this enough. These families of Virginia, these Tidewater elites, these so-called gentry of Virginia, they were not, in fact, English nobility. They were English merchants and shopkeepers and financiers and others who came from places like London to take advantage of opportunities to acquire property and tobacco and servants in the New World, and who made themselves over, in effect, reinvented themselves in the style of the true English gentry. And again, in the material ways of living, we can see by the early 1700s that the gentry home in America was outfitted with the same quality of standard of items, whether it be the wines poured at the dinner table, the clothing worn by the planter's daughter, or as we see here in these pictures, the furniture, the handmade custom furniture purchased from Europe. Now, this was keeping up with the Joneses on a grand scale, if you will, trying to match the English gentry in their taste and style. And the one thing they had on their side, of course, was raw cash. They were making money hand over fist in the tobacco markets. The grandest hall I ever beheld, azure blue satin window curtains, rich blue paper with gilt, most elegant pictures, excessive grand and costly looking glasses. Yeah, that was the description of a house owned by a Charleston merchant, Miles Bruton, who was part of this transatlantic economy and who was wealthy enough to outfit his own home with items equal in grandeur and luxury to those of his counterparts back home. Women were in the forefront of this cultural transformation of the New World. Increased consumption of the sort we've been viewing offered women of middling means multiple benefits, including reducing their labor and serving as a means of self-assertion. So unlike their sisters who were bound to labor as indentured servants in the tobacco fields, the women of the middling and upper classes among the gentry of North America could remove themselves from the necessity of that kind of grinding labor and to become themselves symbols of refinement within the home of the New World elites. In his autobiography, Benjamin Franklin cited the English proverb, quote, "He that would thrive must ask his wife," in describing his wife's expensive purchases made, as he often said, without his knowledge, because, quote, "she thought her husband deserved a silver spoon and china bowl as well as any of his neighbors." So yeah, what we're seeing here is the beginning of a class of consumers who are women, who are daughters, who are wives and mothers in the families of the middling and upper middle class of the New England or of the North American propertied classes, the propertied families. It is the woman of the home who buys the china, and in some cases literally china, bought from the China trade, that is, trade with the Far East, silverware, custom settings, furniture, tables, everything you could imagine that would one day come to be referred to as the lifestyles of the rich and famous. Well, they weren't famous, but they were certainly becoming rich. These elites, these colonial elites, who either profited from their control of land and cash crops, or perhaps through the ports in the shipping business. To connect to that Atlantic economy was to raise one's prospects so that one's wife might ultimately buy a beautiful, handcrafted, engraved and emblazoned silver bowl. Culture of consumption defined by the rules of new rituals in which proper manners, conversation, dress, and furnishing became markers of status. In lieu of actual nobility, people had to, in effect, create their own norms. Tea was a distinctly gendered ritual, for example, as women gathered to drink tea as a form of socialization, but also as a means of displaying their wealth and manners. Despite the wishes of the elite, the complex trade economy, however, was also connected by the common colonist across the Atlantic. That is, it wasn't only the wealthy, but it was commoners too who became part of this web of connections across the Atlantic Ocean. Commoners began to seek new niceties themselves, not just the tidewater elites, not just the wealthy shipping merchants, but more middling folk began to seek new niceties that marked a genteel lifestyle. If you couldn't actually be gentry or even be tidewater elite, you could come close to approximating their ways of dressing, their ways of speaking, and even their ways of drinking tea. During a 1744 tour of the colonies, Alexander Hamilton, no, not that Alexander Hamilton, but an earlier Alexander Hamilton, scoffed at seeing fine goods in the homes of commoners, remarking he found superfluous things which showed an inclination to finery, such as a looking-glass with a painted frame, half a dozen pewter spoons, and as many plates, and a set of stone tea dishes and a teapot. Hamilton saw these things not in the home of a wealthy merchant or planter, but in the home of what was likely perhaps a shopkeeper or store owner. And there was enough class consciousness now to look down one's nose at these attempts at copying, if you will, the habits of the more wealthy and more well-heeled. What we're seeing here, invented after all, is the American tradition of keeping up with the Joneses, the American tradition of associating one's worth socially and culturally with one's ability to acquire consumer goods. The 18th century consumer revolution involved more common people as consumers, those considered by elites to be middling, and that was not a compliment. American colonists consumed about 10% of British exports in 1700. By 1772, that figure had risen to 37%. percent. So a full third of all British exports, that is goods, manufactured goods leaving England, were purchased and used by those living in the 13 colonies. Colonial stores, often featuring display windows, helped to fuel the proliferation of consumption. And keep in mind that it is largely women who are at the purchasing end of this consumer revolution. And so in many ways it is a gendered economy, because so many of the goods and niceties and commodities for the home, serving sets and silverware and silver or pewtered bowls and these kinds of things, were all part of now a kind of gendered economy of refinement and gentility in the home. And yet not all shared in the fruits of a consumer culture, especially on the western edges, where prospects for laboring people of getting ahead paled compared to the established towns. That is, those living on the western frontiers of English settlement were far more likely to have a greater material challenge than simply buying a nice set of china, surviving, coaxing a crop from the soil, fending off Indian attack, these sorts of things. For those unable to buy or inherit farms, many poor people were forced into permanent tenancy or headed west to fight the Indians for frontier land. Quote, flourishing as we may appear to a superficial observer, yet there are many dark spots which on due consideration greatly lessen that show of happiness which the Europeans think we possess. The number of debts which one part of the country owes to the other would greatly astonish you. And so what we get here again is a preview of something very modern, the lament of the debtor, that is, of the middling to lower middling class of folk, often frontier living class of folk, farther removed from the towns and port cities, who sacrificed a great deal not only to survive but also to try and take part in this lively culture of the Atlantic world, this consumer culture, and who as a result often found themselves going deeper and deeper into debt, something that else I would suggest is quite American in its own right. Debt through consumption, keeping up with the Joneses, is a good way to break your own personal bank. But as we'll see in the next part of this lecture, to be poor and yet free, living on the frontier margins of English colonial society, was one thing. To be living unfree, as an indentured servant, as we've seen, or as we'll see in the next part of the lecture, as an enslaved person, was an entirely different thing altogether. So in part 3 of this lecture, we'll take a look at that other fundamental American historical foundation of slavery, Atlantic slavery in the New World of America.